With holiday entertaining just around the corner, it's the perfect time to brighten up your home with new lights from Colorado's largest lighting showroom. Visit Urban Lights' 20,000 square foot showroom today and get 40% off MSRP on the latest trends and styles in chandeliers, pendants, ceiling fans, outdoor lights, and more. Our local lighting experts are ready to help you find your perfect style and get it right the first time. Visit our gorgeous showroom 7 days a week or online at urbanlightsdenver.com.
Jim Duke Radio Network. A rational voice in a world of conspiracy. Jim Duke Perspective.
With me is a guest. He's an expert in the John F. Kennedy assassination, Cory Hughes. Cory, how you doing?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Great. Somebody referred you. They said you're the go-to for this sort of thing. And,
well, I guess that would depend on who you ask, really.
Well, we all have our own sort of expertise, so to speak, in a subject. And, some of us, there's people who always know more than you, but there's so many people that always know less than you. So there's always an audience out there for us. So,
just to comment on that really quickly, there is this kind of orthodox JFK research. I hesitate to use the word community, although that's kind of what it is, that seemingly acts as the gatekeeper of what to believe and what not to believe when it comes to theories outside of the official story, right? So I do not meld very well with that community, and it's rather large, believe it or not.
Are you talking about like the Warren Commission and things?
No, I'm talking about like James D. Eugenio and the modern researchers who have kind of dubbed themselves the leaders of the pack of research, right? But like I really despise the modern orthodoxy of Kennedy research because it is amazing how much information is right in front of everyone's face, and that has been in front of everyone's face for 30, 40, 50 years, that just seemingly goes completely unacknowledged, because there's this kind of what I call the official conspiracy theory, right? Whereas the CIA killed Kennedy, they killed Kennedy over Vietnam. And all of these things these are straw man arguments, right? And so all of these are very easily brushed aside for the truth, which really is always painful, right? No one ever wants to hear the truth, right? Especially people who make a living by having hawked various conspiracy theories over the decades and made tons of money in the process. You know what I mean? They don't want the truth to come out because there goes the grift. So yeah, there's a lot of politics behind the study of Kennedy, aside from the research itself.
Everybody wants to know, who did it, where did the final death blow come from, and they want the questions, and the mystery of it is what keeps the ground open for all these discussions and all the, to most people, it just plays out like a great mystery, right? A great mystery novel or something.
I think it's the greatest mystery of all time. It really is. It is. When you truly start to get into some of the spycraft and the tradecraft that was utilized in the setup of Lee Harvey Oswald and the kind of large-scale preface that developed in the years leading up to the assassination itself, involving all the guys in New Orleans, David Ferry and Clay Shaw, and that whole New Orleans crew, which was, to say that they were tied to the CIA would be really quite wrong. All of those guys were direct contract agents or employees of the CIA the entire time that they had known each other. Really, and the story kind of goes back to mid-1960, early 1961, when the setup of Lee Harvey Oswald really began in New Orleans by David Ferry's crew, for the most part.
Did you see the disclosed documents, and did you get anything out of that when they came out?
No, so let's talk about the documents for a minute. The stuff they released is mostly red herring stuff that really is kind of irrelevant. When you actually get a grip on the relevant stuff, it will all most of it actually falls outside the purview of the Kennedy documents, right? Like all of the stuff that points to mob involvement in the assassination, none of that is in the Kennedy documents. That is in the FBI's mob files, which is totally separate. All of the mob related stuff that is labeled and in the quote unquote Kennedy files, released under the heading of the Kennedy documents. Those are usually like the low hanging fruit. You know what I mean? Stuff that isn't really big shockers. Like everybody knows the government worked with Giancana, and everybody knows that the government worked with Traficante and Meyer Lansky and all these big guys in the mob. So when they put out a document, that kind of confirms some of that stuff, is it really earth shattering? Not really. We already knew that. And there were way better sources than a government document for that anyway, right? So a lot of the stuff you get in the Kennedy files, it's good, solid information. And what I will say about it is, if you are interested in that era, in that time period, late 50s through mid 60s, and you're interested in what was going on in Latin America and what was going on in Cuba, a lot of those documents are awesome, but they have nothing to do with the assassination. They illustrate the goings on and the relationships that were at play behind the scenes when you're dealing with the CIA trying to infiltrate and overthrow all these different leaders in Central America, South America, and the Caribbean, right? So they're really, really good in as far as filling in gaps in previous research on that subject. But like I said, in as far as the assassination goes, from what I can tell, and I've looked at the list of documents that are being withheld, and I don't believe any of the important documents will ever highlight anything having to do with the assassination. What they will do is they will highlight relationships. They will show that certain people knew each other who shouldn't have known each other, right? Public figures who knew each other. And then you get into David Morales. David Morales was a big shot in the CIA. Anytime a job came up that was too, dirty for anyone else, he would take it, And so he was at the heart of the assassination, planning from the CIA's perspective. And so his documents are all classified. But with him in particular, I think what those documents will show are, again, they'll show relationships with people that there's no reason that he should have known. And they'll show travel schedules, perhaps, that he was traveling to places that they can't explain, things like that. But I think a lot of the documents that are being withheld will show relationships to a guy named Jack Valente. And Jack Valente was a associate of Lyndon Johnson, heavily involved in the assassination. And I believe that the remaining documents they're hiding will show relationships with him, particularly with two guys, Charles the Blade Torine, who was a mobster, and a guy named Harry Hall or Harry Haller, who was also kind of a mob/CIA associate. And those documents will lead a trail right to Jack Valente and the White House. And I think that's most of what they're withholding. I don't think it has anything to do with the assassination, but again, it establishes relationships between people behind the scenes that should not be associated. You know what I mean? Jack Valente should not know David Morales, but I promise you he does. And those files will show that. And that will highlight the fact that Jack Valente was a lifelong CIA agent. He, got into the White House November 22nd, hired by Lyndon Johnson. And he was also the shooter on the grassy knoll. So he is quite the character, and everything related to the assassination that they're withholding will have arrows that point right to him. And that's what I believe. So, because everything else is really kind of, from what I can tell, irrelevant. Some of it has to do with Kennedy's connection to the mob, which connects to Marilyn Monroe and all that stuff. So, there's a lot of interesting stuff there. I don't think much of it has to do with the assassination directly at all. So they're getting people all worked up over it, right? Yeah. Right. It's a place to direct people's energy, but it's never going to go.
The redirection. The CIA would they're very, very, very careful on what they would release to the public, and what they do release, they're not going to accidentally release something that is totally damning to their incident, even if it gives a little bit of a push towards what the conspiracy theorists
Mhm.
think. So I know how they work on this double-minded, this give and take. They'll saturate it and they'll put stuff out there that really could point to them, but it's only being baited for the conspiracy theorists. Nobody else really knows what it means or how it's affected. And like you said, they thrown out relationships. So you see the relationship and you say, well, I could connect the dots. And if they knew this, they probably were inside the plan of this. And we would go to those conclusions while the rest of the majority of the masses don't make those connections. And we're basically really doing no credibility for us to tell them about it because they already don't believe us and think it's all kooky anyway.
Right. And as far as document releases, also, I think that you have to think the people who are in charge of releasing the documents today weren't even alive when Kennedy was assassinated.
Oh, yeah.
So I look and I wonder, how do they know what they can and can't release?
Yeah.
There has to be some secret CIA code, like stamped with a certain number or something that's like never release under penalty of death. You know what I mean? Like they've got to have some kind of code. You can't ever release this because they've released some stuff that is so damning. And I'm like, well, the person who actually signed off on this doesn't understand the context, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, very recently, a good friend of mine, Tony, who I work with, I came across a document of a deposition of a woman named Elizabeth Forsling Harris. And the deposition was from the House Committee on Assassinations in 1978, and it had never been released. Well, we FOIA'd it because it turns out she had worked for Sam Bloom. She was the contact. She was the direct go-to between Dallas and Washington in as far as finalizing the motorcade. And she was directly working for Bill Moyers, who was in Washington, right? So she provided an alibi, or attempted to provide an alibi, for Jack Valenti and where he was during the motorcade in an article that came out in 1988, right? So 25 years after the assassination, she comes out with an article. She attempts to give Jack Valenti an alibi. Why she did this, I don't know. Well, so my buddy FOIA'd this deposition, and they released it. And man, the level of contradiction between the article she put out and what's in this FOIA that we just got is unbelievable. It's clear she was working with the CIA. She all but admits it in her deposition, right? But it completely contradicts information that's in the article. But see, the people releasing these documents, they don't know that. They don't know what research has been done and what other people know. So they don't know what to release and what not to release. And so that works out to our advantage very often. And I'll give you a really good example. In I think 2012, in the very first big document dump that they had in years, hundreds of pages of documents came out on a guy named Richard Gibson. And Richard Gibson, as it turns out, was one of the founders of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which Oswald is alleged to have associated with. But I'll tell you what, Oswald never associated with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. That was part of the setup of the character of Oswald. But Richard Gibson, his involvement with Fair Play for Cuba Committee wasn't really known, and it wasn't documented anywhere until long after the Kennedy assassination. He's never called in for questioning when it comes to the FBI or CIA's investigation into Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And it turns out the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, despite the cover story that was initially put out, that it was started by a guy named Vincent T. Lee, who was a Cuban dissident. It actually turns out that it was founded by two guys who both worked for CBS, who were 6 years past Mockingbird and had clearly been working with the CIA since its inception and the OSS during the war, right? So you have the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, allegedly this communist organization to support Castro, right? Founded by two CIA agents. And so they released all those documents on Richard Gibson back in 2012. Why would they do that? Did he piss somebody off? And that's why they released it, even though there would be some blowback and they would hope nobody noticed. So when it comes to the documents and the releases, it's really interesting. And I really sometimes think that they're more clueless than malicious, especially considering the people now don't understand what the hell. They don't have any clue what time it is. Really, they're just going by some old CIA code, whether to release it or not,
CuriosityStream is the streaming service for people who want to know more. And now check out Curiosity's new series, Queens of Ancient Egypt. When pharaohs held the throne, their wives held the power.
We see her taking precedence over the pharaoh, an absolute mastermind.
All hail the queens.
This is unprecedented.
Watch Queens of Ancient Egypt now on CuriosityStream. With monthly, annual, and bundled plans. Find the one that works for you at curiositystream.com.
Oh, that's interesting. So, what did you find? I mean, he was absolutely assassinated. You think Oswald was set up?
Oswald was most certainly set up. He's mostly a construct. So what I did was I went into all of the various incidents where people allegedly interacted with Lee Harvey Oswald, starting with Bolton Ford in January of 1961, where allegedly Lee Harvey Oswald goes to get a bunch of Jeeps to send to Cuba on behalf of a group called the Friends of Democratic Cuba. So there's many problems here. Number one, the Friends of Democratic Cuba and all the guys who are associated with it are a bunch of diehard CIA mercenary types, anti-communists. There's no possibility that Oswald would have been working with them whatsoever. But the real kicker is that Oswald was still in the Soviet Union. And you have a person giving the name of Lee Oswald who looked like Oswald. When people saw pictures of him, they said it looks kind of like him. And so basically going back to 1961, a time when Oswald was provably still in the Soviet Union, you had people impersonating Oswald here in the United States attempting to do various things. Over the course of 2.5 years, or almost 3 years, really, because from January of 61 all the way to November of 63, you have what it boils down to are two men, Kerry Thornley and William Seymour, both closely resembled Oswald. They impersonated Oswald everywhere, upwards of 100 times. There's over 100 documents in the Harold Weisberg files that completely cover every incident reported, whereas somebody interacted with who they thought was Lee Harvey Oswald, who talked about communism or shot rifles or had, gave them more information than they were asking for, right? He would go into a store and next thing you know, he's talking about Karl Marx, right? They were establishing a legend, basically. And they did this really for a long time while he was in the Soviet Union. For at least, let me see, he came back in June of 1962, and that was started in, 18 months. There are at least a dozen or so incidents where Oswald is being impersonated while he's provably in the Soviet Union. So what they were doing, I don't know. I think they were being super sloppy. And they never really realized that years later, people would look back and analyze everything they did with such scrutiny and be able to pick apart the details, right? So I think that played a big part in their poor decision-making in their setup, because they were super sloppy, especially with all the setup of him while he was in the Soviet Union. But then again, there are many incidents that are alleged to have been Lee Harvey Oswald. They say he went to Mexico City and tried to get into Cuba. So basically, I completely debunked the idea that he ever went to Mexico City. He was provably still in New Orleans. I found documents showing that he was in New Orleans closing out his P.O. box and leaving documents with a new forwarding address to the Ruth Payne residence in Fort Worth, right? At the exact same time that he is said to have been arriving in Mexico City. Then we have the incident in Dallas with Sylvia Odio. So another incident where they say that Oswald was hanging out with these Cubans and these anti-communists was that he allegedly goes to this woman's house named Sylvia Odio, and she basically says that they introduced him as Leon Oswald and that they were trying to get her to take part in some recruitment of local Cubans in the Cuban cause, basically was the point of the meeting. And so, but that happened basically wedged between the Mexico City trip and the time that Lee Harvey Oswald is in New Orleans. And that's because it was another man named William Seymour, right? So basically, I have Kerry Thornley in Mexico City. I have William Seymour in Dallas, and I have Lee Harvey Oswald still in New Orleans. So we have three different men all going by Lee Oswald at different times in different places, right? So, but the man who we know as Lee Harvey Oswald, who gets arrested out of the Texas Theater. When I go back and I look at every incident involving Oswald, excluding the ones that we have on film, right? So he's on TV and he does the debate with Carlos Bernier and all that stuff. Like, that's obviously Oswald. However, I cannot put Oswald at any of the incidents that we have been told were Oswald that created this legend. Like, he allegedly goes to the shooting range and he shoots at other people's targets, right? Definitely not Lee Harvey Oswald. And when you go through the statements of the men who actually interacted with him, it is clear that it's not Oswald. It was William Seymour. And how do I know it's William Seymour? Because at around, I'd say 30 to 40% of these Oswald sightings, you have Oswald accompanied by what is often described as a husky Latino with a pockmarked face. And that is a guy named Lawrence Howard. He's the only one in this entire cast of characters who was an associate of David Ferrie, provably in Dallas at the time of the assassination. The getaway car that they used to get out of Dealey Plaza, the green Nash Rambler station wagon, I've linked back to him through his vehicle registration. So I've painted a clear picture in my new book that Lawrence Howard is one of the shooters on the 6th floor. He's accompanied by a man named Lauren Hall. And Lauren Hall and William Seymour were part of this like trio of mercenaries who had been traveling back and forth between Miami and Dallas and Los Angeles at times. And along the way, oftentimes they were reported to have been a trio involving Lee Harvey Oswald. Besides the shooting range at the Carousel Club, where Jack Ruby owned, Oswald is alleged to have been seen there. I can prove that that was William Seymour because he was always accompanied by this husky Latino with a pockmarked face, right? So as you go through all of these various incidents alleging that Lee Harvey Oswald did something, I've been able to basically differentiate the sightings of Oswald with Lawrence Howard, who was actually William Seymour, with another man named Kerry Thornley. Kerry Thornley is actually a fellow Marine with Lee Harvey Oswald going back to 1959. My research, I basically concluded that he was kind of paired with Oswald when both of them entered into the Marine Corps in 59. They were both stationed in the same places, but at different times, with Kerry Thornley following behind Lee Harvey Oswald. This was quite important in Atsugi, where it turns out that in 1959, early 1960, you have Kerry Thornley gathering information specifically on Lee Harvey Oswald that he eventually writes into a book called The Idle Warriors. So Kerry Thornley is this weirdo in the 70s. He becomes this weirdo leader of like the Discordian movement, which is one of these weird CIA-backed counterculture weirdo, freaky kind of, when you read about Discordian, it's just dumb. It's so stupid that it never would have gotten off the ground without the help of the CIA and a whole bunch of LSD and stuff like that. But prior to that, he is clearly involved in the setup of Oswald. He admits to Garrison that he's involved with not only Carlos Marcello, but some naval intelligence guys, along with David Ferrie, Clay Shaw. I mean, he puts himself right in the middle of it. He acknowledges his relationships with all of these people. And then I put him in Dallas as part of the setup where he's impersonating Oswald. And he is the Oswald lookalike who was involved in the shooting of J.D. Tippit, the police officer who was killed about 30 minutes after Kennedy is killed in Northern Oak Cliff, which then leads to the Texas Theater incident. In which Oswald is arrested. But the thing that most people don't know is that Oswald wasn't the only person arrested out of the Texas Theater. Another Oswald lookalike, Kerry Thornley, was arrested and pulled out of the back of the theater. And this is witnessed by not only theater employees, but by neighboring businesses who saw a man get arrested who pulled out the back who looked just like Lee Harvey Oswald. So the use of a duplicate Oswald was crucial because what I believe happened was that the life of Oswald is mostly a construct. And then when it came to setting him up in Dallas, I believe he was doing work with the FBI or CIA directly, or whomever he was, whatever intelligence organization he was working with. I think they were keeping him out of Dallas because I can't put him in Dallas for any of the incidents that we attribute to him. And therefore, he must have been doing something. I can't put him at the boarding houses he was allegedly living at. Kerry Thornley was living at the boarding houses. And this was pretty easy to prove by looking at some of the dates that Oswald was allegedly living in certain places, but comparing them to dates that he actually stayed at Ruth Payne's house, which was most of the time. So it doesn't appear that Oswald ever lived at the North Beckley boarding house. He was living in with his wife at Ruth Payne's house, with the exception of a couple nights at the YMCA. But overall, when you look at the totality of circumstances and you break it down, Oswald was set up to the hilt, and I can't even put Oswald inside the book depository on November 22nd. I can put William Seymour in the book depository on November 22nd. He's actually captured in several frames from the Robert Hughes film. The Robert Hughes film doesn't get much attention, but it has some crucial details. And back in the railroad yard, people that you see there, particularly Detective Trantham, who's not supposed to be on scene for another 8 minutes. And then you have William Seymour, whom I believe was actually working in the book depository, who everybody thought was Oswald. When I went into every single aspect of Oswald in reference to the book depository, everything fell apart. So allegedly he catches a ride to the book depository that morning with Buell Frazier. But I found testimony by a guy named Ed Shields who completely debunks that story and provides testimony that when Buell Frazier got to work, he was alone there that morning, and that he called out to somebody who asked about his rider, where his rider was, and he said he dropped his rider off at the front of the building. And this is extremely important. It sounds like a minute detail, but it's very important because he has always alleged that Oswald got out of his truck and that he walked to the book depository with the rifle in the brown paper sack under his arm, right? But we have testimony that that didn't happen. We have testimony from Ed Shields that that is not what happened that morning, and that there was nobody with Buell Frazier when he pulled up in behind the book depository. So when you start to go into every single incident involving Oswald at the book depository that day, they all fall apart. I would say upwards of 25 to 30% of the book depository employees who provided statements about what they saw that day, I'd say about 25 to 30% of them had never seen Oswald ever until they saw him on television. And that included O.V. Campbell, who was in charge of the book depository. It was his building. He was in charge of hiring and everything. He'd never seen Oswald till he showed up on TV. And when you talk to the guys who actually claim to have seen Oswald, I believe the person that they were interacting with the entire time was William Seymour. Because I had found evidence that William Seymour, who had gone to the rifle range posing as Oswald, planted the name Buell Frazier in several different places for what I believe was an attempt to set Buell Frazier up as a second patsy. And so, so when you look at this complex web of various facts and circumstances, it paints quite a different picture than what the official story tells us, including the fact that I don't believe Oswald ever worked at the book depository. Every job he ever held in New Orleans or Dallas, I can't put him there for a single day. They're front jobs. He worked with the CIA or Naval Intelligence. They were front jobs. He was out doing spy stuff while he was on a payroll at some junk company. You know?
I heard that too. I didn't hear all that. I mean, that's details that you'd think that somebody would look into that because, at the time,
right?
You'd think that would, be part of the investigation, and it doesn't sound like anybody connected it, just like they do today. There's shooters and there's things, and they go, oh, we know who it is and what they did and why they did it. And it was just a random, it's like, wait a minute, how did you know that so quick? And they tend to pose a narrative to us. And I did, so you don't even think Oswald was in Dallas at the time?
I believe he was in Fort Worth all morning until he caught a ride in a cab with a cab driver named Travie Delano Beauclick. He used to go by Beauclick. Beauclick was a cab driver in 1963. Much of the record on him has been erased. You have to look to interviews and references to him as having been a cab driver there. But it's super important because he's related to a woman named Bernice Click. Bernice Click was an associate of Jack Ruby. She spent most of the day on the 18th at the Carousel Club hanging out with Jack Ruby. She owned the building next door to the Carousel Club, which at the time of the assassination for about 4 or 5 days was rented to two guys, one guy named David Leon Miller and another one, his brother, Isidore Max Miller. Now, my research, I've uncovered those names were actually being used as aliases. So just to explain the alias game, aliases aren't names that are just made up out of thin air. How they did this, at least in the 50s and 60s, is they would use aliases of the names of real people whom they knew, and then that one name would get shared around amongst multiple people, right? So then, like in this case, David Leon Miller was Dave Yaris, the Chicago mobster, and his brother Isidore Max Miller, Lenny Patrick. I was able to trace those guys both independently from Miami and from Chicago to Dallas, where the FBI was looking for them, where they both disappeared for 3 or 4 days. Then on the 27th, they both reappear in Chicago. So I traced both of them to Dallas, and knowing their associations through the Dallas mob, I was able to realize that they were the ones using the aliases of David Leon Miller and Isidore Max Miller to stay at this building that was owned by Bernice Click, whose nephew, I believe, was Travie Delano Beauclick, who was the cab driver who I believe drove Lee Harvey Oswald from Fort Worth to the Texas Theater, where he arrived about 1 o'clock. And part of the reason I believe this is because Jesse Curry, the police chief, he inadvertently let it slip when they asked him about how Oswald got to the theater. He let it slip that he caught a cab with Beauclick. When he's asked later about this, he said he didn't say Beauclick. He said Oak Cliff, but he didn't. He clearly said Beauclick. Beauclick. When you dig into Beauclick, like I said, it comes up as Travie Delano Beauclick. And here's the real kicker. He died in a mysterious small plane crash in 1967. Anybody who dies in a mysterious plane crash, to me, was hit by the CIA, okay? Because that was especially big in the late 70s. So you can see there's this intricate web of people in Dallas who all knew each other surrounding Jack Ruby, because Jack Ruby was a mobster, right? Most people don't understand how they're like, oh, he was Jewish. How was he a mobster? Well, most people don't really understand that Jews ran the mob. Meyer Lansky was the boss of all bosses. He controlled everything. He controlled the commission. He controlled Trafficante, Giancana. Everyone thinks Giancana was kind of the boss of Chicago, but he really wasn't. He answered to a guy named Hyman Larner. Hyman Larner was a Jew. Hyman Larner answered directly to Meyer Lansky. Meyer Lansky had a personal, intimate relationship with David Ben-Gurion himself going back to 1945, right? So, when you get into like who was behind the assassination, everyone's like the CIA did it over Vietnam. Really? Well, Kennedy just spent $6 billion on airplanes and helicopters. I don't think he was pulling out of Vietnam. Regardless of what people think about any troop reallocations he might have been doing, you don't spend $6 billion on a war you're not going to fight. So I don't believe any of the Vietnam stuff. What it really comes down to is that between 1960 and 1963, from the time Kennedy took office, his number one priority was nuclear deproliferation, right? Or I can never say that word. But he wanted to get rid of nukes around the world. He was having back-channel conversations with Khrushchev about this. And the Israelis were on a mission going back to 1956 to acquire the bomb, utilizing like Zalman Shapiro out of Apollo, Pennsylvania, the Nuclear Materials and Equipment Corporation, which ended up polluting Apollo, Pennsylvania for the next 100 years with nuclear waste. Basically, the NUMEC Corporation diverted 600 pounds of uranium from what was intended for the U.S. Navy. They basically illegally stuck on a bunch of Meyer Lansky's boats because Meyer Lansky was in charge of the docks. This is where you have a relationship going back to 1945 between the mafia and the Israelis. So by 1963, you've got almost 20 years of established relationship between the mob and the Israelis. And ultimately, Kennedy was going to shut down Israel's nuclear program. That was his top priority, but that was really behind the scenes, and no one ever talks about that. And so that was ultimately why he was killed, and he was killed basically with the green lit from David Ben-Gurion, passed through a Mossad front company called Permindex, passed through another Mossad front, which was working with the CIA out of Montreal called Centre Mondial Commercial, run by a guy named Louis Bloomfield. And this is the connection to Clay Shaw in New Orleans, because Clay Shaw was a board member of Permindex and Centre Mondial Commercial. He was a strong supporter of Israel. Hell, his defense was paid for by the Stern family, of the infamous Stern gang, right? So, like, he was also heavily involved with the ADL and the Schlumberger Corporation, and all that connects back to Permindex as well. And so that's kind of like the main structure of how it came down, because the CIA takes their orders from Tel Aviv, and they have since their inception. Why? I don't know. It has something to do with the large-scale global order, but for some reason, all the orders pass down through Tel Aviv to the CIA, then they do what they want, because they obviously don't work for us, right? The CIA hasn't worked for us ever. And when have they ever done anything in our best interest? We're out there bombing 17 countries around the world over the last 20-something years. Not for us. I promise you that much,
Dear Truck NA, the Toyota Tundra is a hybrid hell yeah with an iForce Max powertrain and forceful V6. The all-new Tacoma brings more bite and more edge than ever. And the 4Runner is part mean streak, part wild side, and an all-around off-road icon. All Toyota trucks sport plush seats with sweet tech and humongous touchscreens, so you'll never feel far from civilization, no matter how far into the wilderness you go. Find them at Toyota.com. Toyota, let's go places.
Now, during the Jeep Black Friday sales event, get $12,500 in lease support on the 2023 Jeep Grand Cherokee Overland 4xE. $12,500 lease support includes cash allowances and $7,500 federal EV incentive provided by lender as a capitalized cost reduction and is subject to change without notice. Lessees cannot claim federal tax credit on their personal tax return. Please confirm this information to ensure its accuracy and availability. Consult a tax professional for details and eligibility. Not all lessees will qualify. Residency restrictions apply. Take delivery from dealer stock by 11/30. Jeep is a registered trademark.
I thought they got CIA was also ordered by the Vatican because I know that they kind of anointed it at the beginning.
It's funny because I look into the Vatican and it seems like the Vatican got infiltrated like right from the jump. Like you got 1897, you got Herzl and the birth of political Zionism, and like by 33 they controlled our government. Like it was over for us but before Hitler even came to power, it was done for us. Like we were fully infiltrated. You have Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, who wanted to like sterilize all Germans. You have like the Supreme Court was compromised. I mean, by 33, we've fallen as a country. Okay, and so really, when you come to understand World War I and World War II, I mean, these are Zionist wars.
Right.
Really.
Well,
right?
we know that. I mean, we have evidence of Rothschild involvement. I mean, it was admitted, through the reports that. Through the banks and through the Rothschilds and through the Round Table, all this that was orchestrated right up through.
Right.
And
then this all connects right to 48 and the founding of Israel. But back up to 1945. So really the birth of the relationship between the Israelis and the mob was in 46 when the Haganah sent Reuven Daphne to meet with Bugsy Siegel in L.A. And the split second Bugsy Siegel realized that there was like a Jewish gang that was murdering people to get a country. He was all on board. And so by 49, you've got the relationship directly between Mickey Cohen, who ran Los Angeles, and Menachem Begin, the future prime minister of Israel and the father of all terrorism in the world, right? The bombing of the King David Hotel internationally recognized the first act of political terrorism in 46. So he was hiding out in Los Angeles, hanging with the mob post 47. And then you have the direct relationship between Ben-Gurion and Meyer Lansky really came to fruition in 47 at a Hotel 14 in New York and the Sonborn Institute, which is where the Israelis were stealing all of our damn surplus World War II weapons because we wouldn't give it to them to fight the Palestinians, right? So what'd they do? They didn't take no for an answer, and they stole them. And they did that with the help of Meyer Lansky, because Meyer Lansky is the boss of bosses, right? And so he hears that these Jews are taking weapons through his ports and getting back to Israel, right? So normally he'd be mad, but he wasn't really mad because he's like, wait a minute, what? You got Jews stealing weapons to go to Israel? I got to find out more about this. And so he creates a direct relationship with Ben-Gurion himself. I mean, that's the top of the pyramid right there. You want to know who's at the top of the JFK pyramid? It's right there. Meyer Lansky and David Ben-Gurion. That is the top. And then from there, it trickled down through Permindex, CMC, the mafia relationship with Israel. And the CIA did an amazing job at maintaining plausible deniability, because even though every single one of the shooters was CIA, they were also mob. So the CIA could be like, that was a mob hit.
Right,
and technically it was.
Yeah, it had
but all these guys still worked with the CIA. Like even Dave Yaris. Dave Yaris, who was, like I said, in Dallas under the name Dave Leon Miller. Dave Yaris is documented as having gone down to the Florida Keys and trained CIA hitmen on how to pull off hits. Like, are you kidding me? This is like our government working with the epitome of mafia hitmen. It's crazy.
Isn't that craftiness of the CIA? I mean, the CIA are so intelligent, you want to use that term, is that they actually set up people of them, agents who are associated with other things so that they can go and have a scapegoat and blame it on the other entity and say, hey, it was the mob, it was it was the bankers, it wasn't us,
So you have a weird governing hand over New Orleans, because you've got like your guys who are like Clay Shaw and David Ferry are pretty high ranking CIA. Well, at least Clay Shaw was. David Ferry had been CIA since the beginning in 47 also. There's a lot of evidence for that. But they had dirt on him. And if they got dirt on you, they treat you like shit. He never made any money. Even after the assassination, he had to blackmail Carlos Marcello to get 50 grand to open a gas station, right? So, like, he even years after the assassination, he was being used for flights down to South America and wherever else they needed, and he never had 10 cents in his pocket. So they held stuff over his head, right? But Clay Shaw, of course, he was a OSS during the war. You know, he went on to be a big shot in the CIA in New Orleans, running the Trade Mart and all that. The relationships are fascinating, man. I really, when you get above that, you get into other guys, like you get into William Gaudet. William Gaudet was a direct CIA employee. He ran a newspaper or a magazine called the Latin American Report, and he would basically go down to South America on behalf of the CIA. He was basically a CIA propagandist, but he would go down there for covert missions, all under the guise of he ran this newspaper, right? But it was obvious, it was run out of the Trade Mart. It was clearly a CIA operation. He's directly responsible for getting Oswald on TV. The chain of events that led to the news crew coming out and filming him on the street, handing out these flyers, which then gets him the interview on WDSU TV with Brunier. That was all a set of dominoes that fell because of William Gaudet. Gaudet also gets a visa to go to Mexico City the same day that Oswald allegedly gets his visa to go to Mexico City. So you have people like Gaudet who are higher up in the chain of command, who are handling people within who are not mob associated, but clearly CIA, right? And then you have guys like Guy Bannister, right? Guy Bannister had 544 Camp Street. That was where all the activities with the Cubans were going on. He allegedly just ran a private detective agency. However, he was former FBI, former naval intelligence, clearly working with the Cubans and their CIA operations. And so you have these like higher level handlers until it gets kind of murky on who's who. You know what I mean? You have like a guy named Martin McAuliffe, who was directly above Sergio Arcacha Smith when he was doing all these Cuban operations. But he was also like a professor at a university who was recruiting people into the CIA, right? He recruited Kerry Thornley and connected him to Guy Bannister. So it's interesting to see the further out in the web you get, like how much responsibility for the assassination do these people have? Could they have been managing all the players but yet not involved? Not likely, right? So you can kind of see what directions the connections to the core of the assassination go and how they branch off. Because when it gets to the CIA, there is a lot of branching off and guys who were clearly like deep, lifelong spooks who it's hard to determine what their role is, but they're lingering around them, you know?
Well, isn't it possible that, I mean, like, you know, in a lot of these things, especially in the secret societies and things like that, people operate in, and they're told a mission or they're told their sector of expertise that they're to control, and through their relationships and who's giving them orders or giving them ideas, they tend to be in the spots that they need to be in to pull some of the weight of the pawns that need to be in the play. So, you know, sometimes I think it can be naive on their part in some of it, you know, some of the aspects, some of the players.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
some of the guys are just told to do something. Like,
exactly,
hey, I need you to go do this, go drive this car. Like, I'll give you one example. Like, there's a guy named Igor Vaganov, Igor Vaganov drives a red Ford Falcon, newer model, so 62, right? And he's clearly associated with some mob guys, clearly associated with some CIA guys, to where it's really weird because you got some of these guys who are super low level. Like, you can tell they're just dummies who are doing a task,
right? But
yet they're connected directly to a CIA guy and a mob guy. You're like, what? Are they just recruiting dummies? What's the deal? But he ends up leaving his car next to the Texas Theater. And after Kerry Thornley is arrested out of the back of the theater, Kerry Thornley is seen 5 minutes later, blocks away, in Igor Vaganov's red Ford Falcon, right? So it's like his whole role was to provide a vehicle for this guy.
Yep.
Right? And so that's it. He drove a car there. He went and left the vehicle. And next thing you know, the vehicle's seen on the other side of town, right? So, yeah, a lot of these guys don't have a clue.
Easily identified. So
right.
That's a lot of things. They'll have something like red, shiny, and something like, that's an eye catcher that people, oh, yeah, I saw that there. And people can connect, the part of the narrative with what, the stage that they set for it. Mm-hmm. One of the stories I heard, that Ruby was not only had firsthand knowledge and knew the officer the officers, the heads, of the police and all this, but he would have known the plan, the marching orders and things like that, and that this is one of the stories that I heard, is that he was trying to attract Oswald to be occupied in the area that he needed to be caught in, and was kind of setting him up in occupation, like had a relationship with Oswald.
Okay, so this is where it gets a little complicated, because we have to remember both William Seymour and Kerry Thornley were associated with Jack Ruby. Those were two of the men who were impersonating Oswald at various places, right? So, including appearances at the Carousel Club. So when you're talking about people knew that Oswald knew Jack Ruby, you have to really question that. Mm-hmm. And was it really Oswald?
Okay.
Right? So anytime you hear about Oswald did this, you have to really take a long, hard look at the individual circumstances to determine whether or not he knew him or not. And honestly, I don't believe that the Oswald that we know as Oswald, I don't believe he ever knew Jack Ruby at all.
Okay. Yeah.
To me, Oswald is clueless. Mm-hmm. Like, he knows nothing whatsoever.
Yeah, like wasn't associated with any of these guys to know even what was going down. Because that's what I heard, is when he was arrested, he was like as surprised as everybody.
So let me tell you the story of the Texas Theater, and hopefully this will put things in perspective. Mm-hmm. So the official story says that Oswald gets dropped off at the boarding house. He then walks really quickly a mile in like 6 minutes, and then he shoots Officer J.D. Tippett, and then he flees and drops his jacket at like the Texaco station, and then he runs to the Texas Theater where he is arrested. Okay, that story is a complete fiction. It is a combination of stories that are melded, and the real story is nothing like that. So Kerry Thornley was the man staying at the boarding houses who looked just like Oswald, who was involved in the Tippett shooting, along with David Ferry. 2 men shot J.D. Tippett. So after Tippett gets shot, David Ferry flees to an address on Belmont in Fort Worth. That's a whole nother story. But you have Kerry Thornley, who doesn't flee to the Texaco, drop his jacket, and then to the Texas Theater. What he does is he leaves from there. He goes down Jefferson, and he tries to get into a upstairs. Like, he goes up a flight of stairs to this like second floor house that used to be used as like a junk shop. It was like a secondhand store, but it was closed. And witnesses saw him trying to get into this building. He can't get into the building. He runs down the steps, and then he runs to what is called the Abundant Life Temple, which was a big church in the neighborhood. So this church, when you dig into the history of the church, it's clearly some kind of front organization. It's really crazy when you get into who was actually on the charter for this church. But he basically hides out in this church until about 12:36. Cops come. They don't see him there. He leaves, and then he goes and he stops at 136 directly in front of Hardy's shoe store, where he is then seen by everyone in the shoe store. There's 3 people in there. Johnny Brewer, who is in on this, and he's a manager of the shoe store. Another guy named Tommy Rowe, who is a friend of Jack Ruby, who's so close to Jack Ruby that when Jack Ruby goes to jail, Tommy moved into his apartment to take care of his stuff. And then Igor Vaganov, who ends up leaving the Red Ford Falcon. These 3 guys are inside the shoe store at the time, okay? This is at 12:36, and this is when Kerry Thornley enters the theater without buying a ticket, and he goes up to the balcony, and this is when the entire series of events starts with the police. The only issue is that we have the testimony of Butch Burroughs, who is the man behind the candy case, and he said that Oswald entered the theater between 1 o'clock and 1:06. That's 10 minutes prior to the official story's account of when Tippett gets shot. However, Tippett was actually shot at 1:06 p.m. So Oswald is entering the theater at virtually the exact same time that Tippett's getting shot by Kerry Thornley, hence this big gap in time. Oswald goes into the theater. He sits in front of a guy named Jack Davis, 18-year-old kid. He then gets up and he sits directly next to Jack Davis. This is a 900-seat theater. There's 22 people in the theater. Jack Davis looks at him like, what is wrong with you? Why are you sitting right next to me? Right? And so Oswald gets up. He does this 2 or 3 more times. Sits down next to somebody. After a couple minutes, nothing is said, and he gets up and does it again. He will eventually sit down next to a pregnant woman. He and the pregnant woman speak for a moment or two, and then they both go back to the lobby. The pregnant woman then leaves the theater. Oswald, at exactly 1:15 p.m., buys popcorn from Butch Burroughs. Butch Burroughs provided all this information to James Douglas, and this is all in his book. Oswald then takes his popcorn, goes back to his seat, and he sits there for 30 minutes eating popcorn, watching the movie, not having a clue anything is going on. And then they storm the theater with film crews and everything. A staged event waiting to happen. They knew it was going to happen. And yes, when you really dig into the nuances and all the ins and outs of who did what at the theater, nobody can determine who the first cops on scene were. When you look at when the call from the theater went to the police department, and then when the calls went out over the radio notifying something's going on at the theater, and then the calls from the cops saying, hey, we just got to the theater, like there's already cops on scene at that point. So I can't figure out who the first cops on scene were. Nobody seems to be able to account for it. Something was covered up there. But yeah, the Texas Theater incident is fascinating. It has nothing like the official story.
Do you think it sounds like he was set up, like the fact there was only 22 people there and he was sitting next to different people. Do you think he had a kind of indication somebody had a message for you or something? And
yeah, he was told to go meet with a handler.
And he didn't know who it was, so he had to go to each person, and it was the pregnant woman?
Correct. And another thing, a pregnant woman had been seen at Ruth Payne's house that previous week.
Okay.
There's 3 pregnant women in the story, including Marina and a woman in New Orleans named Sandra Moffat. And I've eliminated the 2 of them as having been the pregnant woman. So I have a 3rd pregnant woman that I'm looking for somewhere in the story. At some point, I'll come across her.
So they had to make sure he was there, and he was staying there for a little bit. And
right. They had said, hey, you got to go meet your handler, go to this movie. And so they had to know exactly where he was, where he'd be. But I can't put him at the book depository. When I debunked the statements of Buell Frazier, who's obviously they were trying to set up as a second patsy in this thing, but they obviously didn't need it. When I discount his statements and I look at every single thing Oswald allegedly did throughout that day, I can't put him in the building, but I can put William Seymour in the building because William Seymour is clearly captured in the Robert Hughes film out back at approximately 12:32 p.m. I trace his movements then back into the building. And in the Robert Hughes film, William Seymour is wearing a light brown jacket. So I think we've all heard about the story about Oswald was found in the 2nd floor lunchroom and he's drinking a Coke. Right. And that's where Officer Baker and Roy Truly, one of the bosses of the depository, confront him. Roy Truly says, hey, he's an employee. He can go. And so Baker and Truly let him go. Right. That's become part of like the Oswald story. Right. And then allegedly there's a couple reporters who see Oswald as he leaves the building. None of these things happened. These are all fictitious events that were inserted into the story that I easily debunked by going over the raw notes. So allegedly Oswald came down the stairs and 90 seconds after the assassination, he's seen drinking a Coke inside the 2nd floor lunchroom. Well, when you go through Baker's original notes, Officer Baker's original notes, that never happened in the 2nd floor lunchroom. It happened on the stairs between the 3rd and 4th floor. So it never happened in the lunchroom. Oswald was never in the lunchroom. So I can't put Oswald at the building. I can't get him coming to the building. I can't get him getting stopped in the building like everyone said he was. And then when it comes to him leaving the building where he goes and allegedly catches a bus, when you dig into those statements as well, they fall apart also. All the people who allegedly saw Oswald, when you go back and you look at their original statements from either that day or later on that week, none of them saw Oswald. They all admit they never saw Oswald. So all the stories that people saw Oswald leaving the building are fictitious, made up, and inserted into history. So I can find 0 evidence that puts Oswald at the building that can't be explained by William Seymour's presence in the building, which makes a lot more sense because at precisely 12:40 p.m., Oswald is alleged to have been on a city bus that gets stuck in traffic, and then he has to get off the bus where he gets a cab, right? And then he takes the cab to Oak Cliff to the boarding house, okay? So, but witnesses in Dealey Plaza say that at precisely 12:40 p.m., Oswald came out of the side of the book depository, ran down the slope of the grassy knoll, and got into a light green Nash Rambler station wagon, and then fled the area. Well, he can't be doing both. And nobody was on the bus. I completely debunked the bus story. And you have William Seymour, who I can prove, or not necessarily prove, but I can heavily implicate as having been working inside the book depository as Oswald. And then the vehicle he flees in matches a vehicle owned by his compadre, Lawrence Howard, who was the dark-complected Mexican with the pockmarked face, often described as having moles on his cheeks, which is exactly how the shooter on the 6th floor was described by witnesses who saw the dark-complected man on the 6th floor of the depository. So putting together the shooters on the depository, it was important to understand the setup of Oswald in the process, because the guys who set up Oswald, William Seymour, along with Lawrence Howard and another guy named Lauren Hall, those are the 3 guys who I put inside the book depository that day. So the setup of Oswald and the shooting itself intricately linked.
Being energy and water efficient can help you save money and improve the quality of your home or business. Get started with Efficiency Works, a partnership between the electric utilities of Estes Park, Fort Collins, Longmont, and Loveland, alongside Platte River Power Authority. Efficiency Works offers easy energy assessments and connects you to rebates, products, and upgrades. So make efficiency work for you with programs that can lower energy bills, increase comfort, and make upgrading simple and affordable. Check out efficiencyworks.org to get started today.
So let's, in the last few minutes, let's just your summation about, the grassy knoll. It was somebody in the grassy knoll. We have established it was a CIA plot. But how many shooters were there in your estimation? I mean, do you know anything else on that?
So I can put 9 people in position. I can say with certainty 6 of them shot. I've got Lawrence Howard and Lauren Hall on the 6th floor. Mm-hmm. I have Sergio Arcacha Smith, another New Orleans guy, on the roof of the depository. And I say that because a Mauser 7.65 was found on the roof of the depository. This was confirmed by the Dallas Police Department way back in the 60s, although that seems to have fallen from the modern day record. At the Daltex building, I have a guy who was a partner with Sergio Arcacha, the guy on the roof of the depository, shooting from the ledge beneath the fire escape at the Daltex building. Right. So out in the open underneath the fire escape right there, where I actually believe he was arrested in Dealey Plaza that day by Baker prior to his encounter with Oswald. So, and then I have Dave Yaris, Chicago mobster. He was what was edited out of the Nix film. He's between the pergola and the fence. If you watch the Nix film, you can see him clearly, basically with his back after the shots have already been fired. And then on the grassy knoll, I have 2 people. I have David Ferry, who fired the first shot that struck Kennedy in the throat. And I have Jack Valente as having fired the shot that took off Kennedy's head. Jack Valente, I go into detail in my book. I have a whole chapter on him. And then I go into pretty extensive explanation on how he escaped and how the Secret Service car helped him escape to Parkland Hospital. Basically, after the shots are fired, Jack Valente goes over the top of the knoll to the other side where he's picked up and transported to Parkland Hospital by the Secret Service car. When you look at McIntyre photos number 1 and number 2, that is the proof of everything. McIntyre photo 1 and 2, the most important photos, maybe next to some clips from the Robert Hughes film. But McIntyre photo number 1 and number 2 are the clearest proof of conspiracy involving the Secret Service car, because the Secret Service car pulled into Dealey Plaza with 10 men on it. 2 men get off, Clint Hill and Dave Powers. There's only supposed to be 8 men on this car. By the time it goes under the overpass and gets to McIntyre photo number 2, they are back to having 10 men on the car. The Secret Service car picked up 2 men as they passed underneath the overpass. And to me, that is the most slam dunk proof of any type of conspiracy in the assassination at all. And the 2 men they picked up were David Morales and Jack Valente. And I discuss this in detail in my book.
So it was simultaneous shootings to make sure they got the mark? Is that kind of, I think
it went in waves. If the first crew at the book depository would have taken him out, then the other shots would not have been fired.
I heard
stories,
as he
went. It was kind of.
I heard names thrown in like Charles Harrelson.
Yeah, so that's the red herring. Charles Harrelson definitely worked with the mob, definitely was connected to these people, but he was provably like in a jail in like Houston at the time.
Oh, okay. So that's Woody Harrelson's father, by the way.
That was one of those things that he kind of held up as kind of like maybe I did, maybe I didn't, but he didn't know. He was accused of being one of the tramps. I identified the 3 tramps. The 3 tramps are they're Cleveland mobsters, including Danny Green. The Irishman Danny Green, before he was the Irishman, was working with the Cleveland mob. That's how he got to be the head of the Longshoremen Union at the time. So him and a guy named Leo Masseri, who was his boss in the Cleveland mob, or a guy who he would have taken orders from, and the short tramp, who was also identified as the real Raul, who set up James Earl Ray and the Martin Luther King assassination by James Earl Ray, I identified him as a guy out of Houston named Vincent Calderon Jr., who was the former brother-in-law of Jack Valente, who was on the grassy knoll. So I kind of put those two guys together for a lot of things. There's a big backstory with that and the Winterland ice skating rink that David Ferry allegedly goes to and stuff. So it gets kind of complicated when it gets to those two.
Yeah, I've seen pictures of this guy that I met had inside pictures. He knew somebody inside. He couldn't, of course, tell me who, but I saw the pictures, black and white pictures of some forensic pictures, and they were clearly. He was showing me how they were obviously doctored, never made it. His body had side taken to the side before it went on forensic. But at the time it went to forensics, the holes, it was unclear. It was blown out of proportion. You couldn't tell where anything would have came from.
So I'm pretty convinced that the damage to Kennedy's head was such that his brains got blown right out of his head.
Right.
Like there was no, there's an argument, where's Kennedy's brain? Like if you listen to the doctors and the ER techs who are at Parkland, that brain was gone, dripping out of his head by the time he got there. So, and the hole, he gets shot in the temple and the hole comes out the back of his head. I mean, the hole in the occipital bone must have been 4 to 5 inches across. I mean, like everything would have just come right out of there. Plus, you have like the Harper fragment, which they found in Dealey Plaza, which was the piece of occipital bone. So yeah, like the pictures of the autopsy are total fakes, complete fakes. Yeah, they're not even close to what really happened to Kennedy's head at all.
Yeah,
and he could not have been shot from behind in the head because his face. Every test that's ever been done with various rifles and like those gel skeleton things. Every single one with a strike to the back of the head causes the entire face to blow off.
Oh, yeah.
So he definitely could not have been hit from behind.
Yeah, that would close range like that, it would have been blown right out. And it wasn't. And this is, I mean, there's a lot of logic involved that you can tell it was something other than the narrative, the report. And they definitely covered it up. So this has been an all-time mystery, so to speak, but you've uncovered a lot of names and a lot of relationships and a lot of things that I think most of us haven't heard. A lot of names you came up with besides Valenti. I don't think I heard of many of those other names mentioned. Associated
because when people talk about Kennedy, they talk about the same things over and over again.
People, the same,
and it's like those names will get you nowhere. Those names will get you nowhere.
All right. And want to sum up with any last minute thoughts or?
Well, yeah, sure. All this stuff is in my book, A Warning from History, which is now available on Amazon.
And
that's pretty much it. I name every name, anything you want to know. The Three Tramps. I mean, all that stuff. I explain everything.
And how can they reach you? How can they contact you?
You can reach me if you go to CoryHughes.org. That's my website. All my contact information's up there.
All right. Well, thanks, Cory. I appreciate you shedding a different insight on this that we haven't heard yet. Like I said, we have people coming up with these different perspectives of it, and to some it's speculative. My information's very speculative of what I've concluded. I've used some of the disclosed information to make some connections that I felt were pertinent at the time, but you had a perspective that these things were thrown out there, and you had inside names and links to mafia and things like that I don't think many people may have thought of. And
I was a cop for about 8.5 years. I've worked thousands of cases, and to me,
why weren't you on this case at the time? No.
This was just like following a case. This is just like how you would work a case, right? Like then the names they lead you to just went way outside the orthodoxy, is how I call it.
All right, then let me ask you one question based on that expertise that I didn't know you had. If you were on the scene, first of all, would you have tried to push for more information? And secondly, do you think, knowing what you know and how sloppy it was investigating, that they basically didn't investigate? They left out so many things?
Oh, yeah, totally. And see, here's the thing, like the real proof to me, I hate the word proof. There's no such thing as proof. There's like high degrees of evidence, but proof
let's say
is like
evidence. I use that too. Yeah.
But like when it comes to like tipping their hand, let me put it that way. The only address that Oswald allegedly gave to the book depository on his job application was the address in Fort Worth. Okay, the address of Fort Worth at the Payne's residence. There was no other mention to them or any reason for them to know of any other addresses. Okay. When Roy Truly, who was clearly in on this at the high CIA level, who was one of the managers of the depository, when he gets with the Dallas Police Department, he provides them not only that address, he not only provides them with the address at 1026 North Beckley that he never should have had, he provided them with an address on Elspeth Street that Oswald had only stayed at for like 2 nights. And so they should never have had this information. He never allegedly gave them this information. But yet, all of a sudden, the Dallas Police Department knows exactly where to go to find Lee Harvey Oswald, who I promise never stayed at any of these addresses. Right? So there are so many incidents where they have information that they should not have. Right? And then when you get into like Roy Truly, turns out Roy Truly, OSS during World War II, turns out he's married to a woman who's the first cousin of Fred Korth. Fred Korth was in the Air Force, but I believe he was a Secretary of the Navy at the time of the assassination. And Fred Korth was directly petitioned by Oswald to return from the Soviet Union. And Fred Korth happened to be the lawyer when Marguerite Oswald got divorced from her husband, whose name was Ekdahl. Fred Korth was the lawyer who worked for Ekdahl during the divorce, so he already knew Oswald and the entire family. And now, mysteriously, coincidentally, Oswald happens to get a job run by Roy Truly, who's married to Fred Korth's first cousin. BS. I don't buy it for a split second. The whole thing was set up in advance through the connections that they already had. And when you start to look into Oswald's history, everything about his life is a construct. Wow. They made him up out of thin air, really.
Wow. They made up the whole narrative of the character they wanted.
And his whole life.
Yeah. Yep. Wow.
Going back to 47, John Armstrong found documents showing that there was a duplicate Oswald going back to 47.
Why him? Because it was an easy...
I think it was a plot to get a spy in the Soviet Union. Nothing more, nothing weird.
I mean, why did they pick him? Like, what was...
I think it had to be some sort of familial connection. We don't know. Everything they tell us about his father is like, I think is bogus. When you look at his father, there's only one known picture of his father, and he looks a whole lot like a guy named J. Walton Moore, who's an FBI agent in Dallas. It's like they're reusing photographs of people, which I've caught them doing before. But yeah, I don't believe anything they say about Oswald's father. I think Oswald's father was somehow connected. He was born in 1939, so that puts it before all the OSS stuff. So what the hell kind of intelligence could have been going on? I mean, it had to have been some sort of connection that was made during the war that by the time the war was over and the time the CIA came around in 1947, they had this family ready to go. You know what I mean? So it had to have been something developed during the OSS days. It had to have been during the OSS days, or in the 45 to 47 gap when we allegedly didn't have an intelligence agency, which is a joke. God, I'll have to write a book on that one day. The years between 45 and 47, they were busy.
Yeah.
Man, busy.
Wow.
And there was no name for it, no name for what they were doing because there was no CIA yet. So
right. Wow. Well, we'll have to have you back on talking about that stuff, I guess, someday.
Yeah, someday.
All right. Cory, thanks. Cory Hughes, thank you very much for joining us and giving that insight. And people can check you out, especially if they want to get the names, the names.
Yeah, so I do a podcast called Cory Hughes Bloody History.
Oh, okay.
And it is the single most in-depth analysis of the documents that are out that there is. Like I did 10 parts on Kerry Thornley alone.
Wow. So that's in-depth.
It's deep.
Yeah.
I read the documents to you and I give you my analysis in real time. So it's pretty, you got to be a certain kind of person to be able to sit through it. But if you really like history, it's definitely for you.
There might be people that will check out that series and those connections because we only hear the one side, the very limited Reader's Digest version.
Right.
It's not even the Reader's Digest version. It's more like the the CNN version.
Yes.
So, all right. Thank you for joining us. I really appreciate your time.
No problem. Thank you.
My website is jimdukeperspective.com. You can check that out too. And share this information if you find it interesting, and tell your friends about us. And if you could, subscribe to us on any of your podcasts, your favorite podcast players. We're on all of them. So until next time, God bless, and we'll see you.
Being energy and water efficient can help you save money and improve the quality of your home or business. Get started with Efficiency Works, a partnership between the electric utilities of Estes Park, Fort Collins, Longmont, and Loveland, alongside Platte River Power Authority. Efficiency Works offers easy energy assessments and connects you to rebates, products, and upgrades. So make efficiency work for you with programs that can lower energy bills, increase comfort, and make upgrading simple and affordable. Check out efficiencyworks.org to get started today.